Hello, I'm Lushcat, and this video is going to be on the basic setup for the workflow between Blender and the Unreal Engine. First thing is setting up the scale in Blender. So I'm just going to delete everything. And then in the Scene tab here, just setting the length to metric and the unit scale to 0.01 for the centimeter standard. Now this is going to give me some camera clipping here. And a lot of people might tell you to set the clip end to 10 kilometers or 1 kilometer, but this is going to introduce a new problem, especially if you like working in orthographic mode. So as you can see on this cube, in perspective, it looks perfectly fine. But in orthographic, you can see through the mesh. Now Blender has a button specifically for this, but in orthographic mode, it doesn't do anything. So what I usually do is just fiddle around with the clip end until it looks good, and I found about 100 meters to work well enough. And as you can see here, you can decide whether or not you want to see through the mesh with this button now. It does still have some problems on the edges, as you can see, but this is pretty much the best I've been able to get it. So next, we're going to create a multi-object scene in Blender and try to have everything import correctly into UE4. First things first, as you probably know, is making sure your transform is applied. Location and rotation at 0 and scale at 1. When this is done for all selectable meshes, next thing you're always going to want to have is a UV map. So with everything selected in edit mode, just hit U, and I'm using the Smart UV project, doesn't really matter, and it'll create a UV map. Now you can create a second UV map if you click the little plus button down there, and Unreal Engine is automatically going to recognize that as a light map. But I've had to fiddle around more with that one in UE than the one automatically made by Unreal. So I'm not going to create a second UV map here, but that is an option. When that's done, I'm just going to select Suzanne's eye here with L, and then shade it smooth. This is so I can demonstrate something later with morph targets. And then I'm also going to shade this entire cylinder smooth, and then use the auto smooth option to get those crisp edges up there to show that shading does import correctly into UE4. Now I want Suzanne to have some morph targets, so I'm going to click plus twice, with the key one being the actual morph target Unreal is going to recognize. Then with proportional editing, I'm just going to give Suzanne here a little surprised face, so it's easy to see. And as you can see here, the morph target does work, at least in Blender. Now, the other three objects, I want them to be static and for them to have collision. And I just want to get the collision finished here in Blender. So I'm going to duplicate this cube and then rename it UCX underscore, and then the exact object name I want the collision to correspond with. Then I'm just going to duplicate the cube again and give the cylinder a cube collision, so it's really easy to see if it imports correctly or not in Unreal. When that's done, my final object is a torus, which is a concave shape. So what I'm going to do is duplicate it, and then with everything selected in edit mode, I'm going to hit space and then type in convex hull or conv. By selecting this, it takes any concave geometry and converts it to convex, so that Unreal recognizes it as collision more easily, and then again renaming it UCX underscore torus. Now all collision, you want it to be in the same place as the object, and you want it to also have its transform applied. So again, anything selectable in the viewport, if you're in object mode, you want its location, rotation and scale to be zeroed out basically. And you can also select your mesh or your collision and use a modifier such as decimate or triangulate to maybe make UE4 work with it a little better, but I'm not going to do that here. Don't know if it's necessary. Now you're ready to pretty much export everything. Now because Suzanne has morph targets, we want to select everything else except Suzanne, like so, and export it as an FBX separately. So here I'm just going to select selected objects. Negative Z forward and Y up is fine. You want your smoothing to be edge, and I always deselect add leaf bones by habit. Then export it out. Now you want to export Suzanne separately. So I'm just going to select her and then export FBX. And I'm going to rename the file so it doesn't overwrite my original. And again, make sure selected objects is checked, negative Z forward, Y up, smoothing at edge, and no leaf bones, and then just export. On a side note, if you have an armature like this one, you'd basically want to make your changes as you normally would, to the armature. And then you want to apply those changes on the armature first, like so, then select your mesh and apply the changes to the mesh then. Basically anything selectable in object mode, you want its transform applied. And then it should work correctly in Blender and it should import good in UE4. And as a rule of thumb, you want to keep one armature per FBX file, and you want it to be bone based, because as far as I know, object constraints and all that do not import into UE4. So now we're going to import our 4-object scene into Unreal Engine. So first I'm going to import my static objects, and I'm going to have combine meshes, check down here. And I'm going to be using the normals and tangents on MICT space. Even though it's grayed out, it does matter what the normal generate method is set to. And then here's just the rest of my settings, but I think they're all stock anyway. And now we're going to import. And there you have one object. And if you open it, you'll see that the collision looks like it imported correctly. Their placement in the scene looks correct. And even on the torus, it looks like our collision has imported correctly. So that's good. Now I'm going to import those 3 objects again, except this time I'm going to deselect the combined meshes so that they come in as 3 separate objects. So here I'm deselecting combined meshes, and I'm also just make sure one convex hull is checked up here, and there, 3 objects. And then again opening up the cylinder to make sure that the placement in the scene, aka pivot point, is correct, looks like. And the collision should also have imported correctly. So that's good. Shading looks good too. Now we want to import Suzanne. So there's quite a lot of things that can happen here. First off, make sure it's a skeletal mesh. And then I'm using import normals and tangents again, but this time in the built-in method. And again, you want to have import morph targets checked up there. And here's again the rest of my settings, but I think they're all stock. Now to import, I don't think this error matters here. And so if you check it out, the shading looks fine. And if you can see, the morph target looks fine, the shading is preserved, but there's some strange shadow parallax going on. And this is because of the import normals on the built-in method. And there's also little problems with small face tearing you might find around your mesh like this one. The next problem you're going to find always on MICT space. So again, I'm going to import Suzanne. Make sure it's a skeletal mesh, and this time I'm going to set it to MICT space, and it does not matter what you set the import method to. MICT space will always cause your shading here to disappear after a certain threshold, and I'm not sure why this is a problem, but it is. So if you have sort of like a low poly mesh or something like that, it's not going to preserve that with MICT. Otherwise there isn't any tearing, but that's a pretty big deal breaker. Now the next import method basically is pretty much the one I've found to work best. and that is the compute normals on the built-in generation method. So here I'm going to select compute normals, built-in method, and I'm also going to select use T0 as ref pose. As far as I know, the only thing this does is get rid of that little error screen. I don't really think it does anything else. And here I'm going to import Suzanne again. If you open it, you'll see that the morph target works, the shading is preserved, and there isn't any shadow parallax. It's a little bit framey right now because I put the scale, like the engine scalability up, so you can see the shadows a little bit better. And then here again, the shadows are maintained okay. It's on medium, I believe. If you set it on high or epic, they'll be better. But here's kind of the biggest problem with compute normals on the built-in, and that is pretty significant face tearing. Now the way to get rid of this is to pre-triangulate your mesh in Blender. So what you do normally is select your mesh and then find the triangulate modifier and apply it. But if you have shape keys, it's not going to let you. So what I do is duplicate the mesh. Then on the original, I delete my shape keys, making sure I delete the basis last. And then I apply the triangulate modifier. Then on the duplicated mesh, I want to get rid of the triangulate modifier. And then select the key I want to transfer to my original mesh. Shift select the other mesh, the down arrow here, and transfer shape key. Also make sure you unpin it. Took me a while to figure out why my value slider wasn't working. So there it works. Now if you have multiple keys, just make sure it's selected. I'm going to just deform her ear a bit here. Make sure that key is selected, shift select the original, down arrow, and then transfer the shape key. Unpin it again, and there, you transfer all of your shape keys to a triangulated mesh. Now you can get rid of the duplicated one, and this should be fine. You can also UV unwrap it again. I don't know if it's necessary. And now the compute normal method on the built-in should be perfect. Now shading. So if you have an object like this in Blender, but it just comes out like this a lot of times in Unreal, I think I have a good guideline to get it like this, using these UE4 normal import options. So here I have my guidelines for FBX and OBJ static meshes, and then FBX skeletal meshes. For static meshes, I found that the import normals and tangents on MICT space has been fine, and on FBX skeletals, the import normals and tangents has also been fine. But the problem starts to come when you have morph targets. So here I have it continued with morph targets. I have FBX skeletal here that's not triangulated, and then I have FBX skeletal with morph targets that is pre-triangulated in Blender. Basically what I found is that if it's not triangulated, your best chances are to use the import normals on the built-in. You might get some weird shadowing, you might get some slight tearing, but if pre-triangulating is not an option, this is probably going to come out the best. And then for if you want to pre-triangulate your mesh, the best one has been compute normals on the built-in. It preserves shading, there's no tearing, and the shadowing looks fine. So basically, to conclude, your import normals on the built-in works very consistently if you don't have morph targets on both static and skeletal meshes. Import normals and tangents is the same, and then you want to have the compute normals on the built-in if you're using a pre-triangulated skeletal mesh with morph targets. And now finally to root bones and root motion. So let's say you have an animation here and you have root motion and you enable it and then you process it, but nothing is happening. This is likely because Blender has added an armature root bone above all your other bones. Here I have the exact same mesh with the same animation. I'm going to do the same thing again, but this time I don't have an armature bone. And there you can see he's going off. Now, if you're using 4.16 or above on Unreal version, you don't need to worry about this anymore. But if you want like to standardize your FBX files, or you're using a previous version because you haven't gone up yet, this guy called Chris Redbeard has a great webpage here on how to get rid of the armature bone in the Blender export. So yeah, he also mentions the UE4 tools add-on, pretty useful. And also you want to get Notepad++ because it's almost impossible to find these lines without it. But yeah, just find this place here. He says where to find the file. Make sure you open Notepad++ as an administrator. Then find lines 2465 through 67 and just comment out these 3 lines. And then make sure to save your file and that you're in administrator mode, and you'll be ready. This will standardize your FBX files. And that's the end. I hope you liked my video. I would like to come out with more soon. If you have any questions, if you have if something is different, if it's not working for you, please comment. And yeah, if you enjoyed my video, I'm glad. Thank you. Thanks.